because I see this with women. I see that women do not fully understand and appreciate that they are made in God's likeness. And I see time and time again women that struggle with self-worth and what is their value. If we fully understood that we have been created by God in His likeness, that would certainly change our way of thinking along how we view ourselves. And, like I said with the comparison piece, how we view others.
Hello and welcome everyone to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. I'm Matt Kaufmann, and I'm delighted to have Amber Miller with me here in the studio. Welcome, Amber.
Thanks. It's good to be here, Matt. I'm excited about today.
Well, Amber needs no introduction, but she is a clinician here at ACCFS, and as you might guess, she has a large proportion of her clientele would be women, and we're glad to have her here to step into that space and to offer the help that women need and the unique need that they have. So you bring a wonderful perspective, Amber, and a perspective that can be very frequently and oftenly missed. So and today's topic is going to give you an opportunity to speak to some of that, as our topic is womanhood.
Yeah, it is an exciting topic to me. Like you said, Matt, I've had the opportunity to have hundreds of conversations with different women from different backgrounds. And the one thing that I know is that this is not a clean-cut subject, and there's lots of strong emotions around what does it mean to be female? What does that mean biblically? Where are we going? You know, all of these different things. What does this mean in church? Lots of different ways that we could go on this topic.
Yeah. Our culture and our times really bring this issue to the forefront. Mm-hmm. Gender, sexuality, what is male, what is female.
Mm-hmm. You can't really understand God's design for women until you understand some of those issues issues. And like you already highlighted, gender, what is God's creation, and all of this. And so I think, we're going to have to go back to some of that at the beginning and really understand some of those foundational pieces.
And as we set this topic up, let's just maybe be clear about a few concepts I think that kind of help us as listeners as we listen to this. Mm-hmm. And that is, some of our listeners, Amber, this is not even on their radar, right?
Right.
The concept of, we talk about gender, this is all very basic and cut and dry. Uh-huh. And what a neat thing.
Yeah.
Really, right?
I'm so thankful for that.
The concept of femininity and what does that mean and how that intersects church is all settled in certain minds. But for others, it's perplexing and it's difficult. Mm-hmm. Isn't it?
And there's a heart to get it right. I think that's what it boils down to, too, is that I'm not meeting women that are like, how can I push this issue? How can I do this? I'm meeting women that are struggling and having this tension that are like, what's God's design? What is my role? What should this look like? How do I use my gifts? What's appropriate? And so those are the questions that they're asking more than how can I take charge and lead us into the 21st century? That's not the spirit that I'm getting.
Yeah. So Amber, you've mentioned a few times God's design. And so certainly that must be a place where we need to begin. And so take us in Scripture to a good starting point as we discuss gender.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Genesis 1 is where I start a lot of times. And I think about how it says that God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he him. And so just to even be able to acknowledge from the beginning, God had a design and a plan and a purpose in creating male and female, different.
Yeah. And in verse 28, so the next verse after what you just said, he goes on and says, and God blessed them. Isn't that neat? Mm-hmm. God blessed gender. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a phenomenal concept. And this is all pre the sin, right? This is all pre-fall concept here. Yeah. Gender comes onto the scene by God's design and creation as part of the very good creation that he made, and he blessed it.
Mm-hmm. I love that piece that you said, because it's true. This is uncorrupted. This is God's plan uncorrupted. They had male and female. And I think we get lost in the weeds so much anymore because this is life after the fall. And so we do start to have these questions and wonder, what does this mean, or why this, or why that?
And I think that distinction is important. We see this lens of gender through some corruption, don't we?
Yeah.
And very often we're reacting at reactions, which isn't always it puts us in a really good spot.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, it totally does. I think of how Christians have reacted to feminism. There's some truths to feminism,
Yeah.
which is a dangerous thing to say, but I feel like it's been taken to extremes. And there are some pieces that, like anything, truth can get interwoven with lies, and then that's where it gets so messy.
Feminism has reacted to accurate observations of gender misuse.
Right.
Now, they have taken solutions to maybe some inappropriate ends.
Mm-hmm.
But there again, we react to reactions.
Yeah.
And it's so important that maybe we don't react to reactions, but we react to or are conformed by the Word of God.
Right. And anytime that you have a reaction to something else, what happens is you end up getting people that are marginalized. You end up going to an extreme. An area where you could see that would be trying to, again, support women that stay at home, which is a good thing and a noble thing. But yet, I know many women that have felt marginalized then because due to circumstance, they do work outside of the home. Due to their gifting, they feel that God has called them to do something different. When we make very sweeping statements, it ends up hurting those that we don't intend to.
Yeah. If we're only knee-jerk reactions to certain platforms that we want to distance ourselves from, we can get into unhealthy places.
Right. I mean, that really is the heart that we both have today, I would say, Matt, is to let our listeners know that we just want to walk through this with wisdom and to just guard against maybe our own assumptions or maybe our own beliefs in this area, because I think it's very easy to get sideways.
Well, I'm excited to do that, right? So you've quoted there in Genesis where gender was created. So God divinely created gender. And in our likeness, right? God made it in his likeness. The God likeness. What do we get out of God likeness? And how does that change our view of just people knowing that we are in his likeness?
This one is so unique because I see this with women. I see and that women do not fully understand and appreciate that they are made in God's likeness. And I see time and time again women that struggle with self-worth and what is their value. And I also see this edge of competition and comparison, and that also is just so ingrained, it feels like, in females. And so it's interesting to go back, and I feel like if we fully understood that we have been created by God in his likeness, that would certainly change our way of thinking along how we view ourselves and, like I said with the comparison piece, how we view others. If we're looking at our brothers and sisters through a lens of love, through a lens of they're God's creation, God made them, they are in his image, that's definitely going to change the way we look at race. It's going to change the way we look at gender. It's going to change the way we look at so many different pieces, status, you name it.
I love, in James chapter 3, he talks about be careful of the tongue, right? That weapon of mass destruction that we have in our mouth, the tongue, and how we bless God, and at the same time we curse men. But then he says we curse men who have been made after the similitude of God. So I think James is hitting on that point that you just did, Amber, and saying, whoa, we need to be careful when we are addressing a God image bearer. That concept brings us into an alignment on how we ought to view each other.
No, I love that. I think that's well said. And it is true that can be a foundational piece that we should all start with. I think about how we said in Genesis 1, it says male and female. I think there's a couple characteristics that are unique to women that really highlight God.
What you're suggesting is that women characterize certain characteristics of God more in force than perhaps the male counterpart. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right.
And so both genders are necessary or required for God's image to be in his created humankind.
It's true. And so when we think about that, that's not to say that men are less than because they don't have this, or women are less than because they're maybe more like that. But that when you have both genders together, they perfectly illustrate God's being. And so one of the ways that I think women really illustrate this would be in the sense that they are a helper. You read that again in Genesis where Eve was created as a helpmeet to Adam. God could have created another man, but he didn't. There's a number of reasons for that, but he could have. And so just to be able to recognize that there is a uniqueness there and there's a reason that he created women to be a helper.
So you've just placed your finger on one possible characteristic that you're suggesting is more in force in women. and that is this helper quality. Right? And I love that because it is actually such a God word. When we track that name through the scriptures and find it bubble up in Psalms where David cries out about God being a helper, we see that's reserved for God himself. And so I completely track with you that this is a part of God that he's placed in women. So what does that look like? Women more as helper.
So you see that very clearly, I would say, in the marriage relationship where both genders are working side by side for each other. And you see that in just the nurturing, I feel like, that mothers can give. But I also don't want to exclude those that are single, because I think we also see this in the New Testament church. We see this in examples like Mary and Martha, where Christ visited their home and they cared for him and opened up their home in a very special way, in a meaningful way, where they were helpers to Christ and his ministry. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for women, even if you're not married, to be able to illustrate this beautifully and to be a helper of those around you.
I think that's fantastic, even with those examples. And we could go on with more names of those that surrounded Christ. He had women that were helpers in his ministry, certainly were present. And you see that helper quality coming out, not only in marriage, but also in the larger sense of the church.
One passage that's very interesting to me is in Luke 8. And in this passage, it talks about how Jesus was traveling from city to city with the 12, and certain women were with him. It actually says that in Luke 8. And just that idea that women were traveling right alongside Jesus as he was going around healing people and ministering to others, it's very exciting. And he actually names like Mary Magdalene and Joanna. And so people by name, women by name, and just how out of the box that had to be at that time. And so helper in this sense is not meant to be derogatory. It's meant to be exciting, that you can be right alongside Christ and just doing his work.
Philippians chapter 4. Paul writes, he says, "And I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help those women which labor with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and with other my fellow laborers, whose names are in the book of life." Isn't that interesting?
It is.
He spoke exactly to that. These women are helpers in the ministry.
And I love that when you look at how Christ lived his life, this whole idea of gender also comes into clarity. In so many ways, Christ just was so countercultural into this idea where women were walking alongside of him. They were learning, being used in so many unique ways. And so as Christian women today, living in New Testament times, I believe we should be very encouraged by that.
Can I put my finger on something? Because you mentioned Christ was countercultural, and I believe he was. But he was not primarily countercultural. He was pro-truth.
Right.
And that placed him counter to culture. Does that make sense?
No, that's a great clarification.
And that distinction is important.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we can be countercultural and not pro-truth.
Right.
And so that's what we learn of Christ. As we watch him walk and do things and say things and surround himself with unlikely people, simply because he understood gender design and he walked according to the truth of it. And where it was counter to culture, he walked countercultural. And where it wasn't counter to culture, he didn't.
No, that's a great point, Matt. It is great. And I think that's why we have to go back to Scripture. We can't look at what is culture doing. And I think a lot of times church can react to the culture of the present day to form their opinion. But yet, what does the Bible say about this topic? Where do we rest? And that has to be the place that we come back to.
My interest is piqued. Helper. Okay, what is another characteristic that we see out of women where God has placed his likeness in force in the gender of female, perhaps more than male?
So another one that comes to mind would be just being a life giver. Certainly you think of that in women's ability to incubate life and just to be able to nurture and raise up children.
Which is what Eve means, I think, right? Her name is Eve, mother of all living.
Right.
I think. So I think Adam put this concept together as well and saying, this is a divine, unique difference.
Yeah. And so there is that physical component where women's bodies have been designed to be able to do that. And I would also say that there's an emotional component along with women's design, where in so many circumstances and situations, they are able to minister and to meet emotional needs in such a special way. You know, I think of different women in my life that have not been my biological mother, but have stepped in so many ways and supported me, whether that is helping to meet physical needs or emotional needs, spiritual growth just over the years. And I feel like that's a very life-giving characteristic where they're meeting those different needs.
Oh, I completely agree. I completely agree that the female gender has that wonderful perception of what it means to give life and to inspire life and to encourage life. I've got mothers in the faith that come to my mind as well who have done that to me, who have engaged me in conversation, who have taught me in the youngest grades. I still remember. And when I meet them, it's a special meeting, because I am, in a sense, a spiritual child. Does that make sense?
It does.
And I think that's tremendous. And you've already brought up the point of those that surrounded Christ. But we see life-giving among the women followers of Christ and the women in the New Testament as well. Why don't you speak to a few of those?
Yeah, you see that in Acts, certainly, with Priscilla. You see that with Lydia as well. You know, women that were nurturing new believers and were walking alongside and, again, doing some of this work. I guess another point where I really love the use of women in the gospel is in the resurrection story, and the fact that they were just going about their day. I think of the women that were going to the tomb, and they ended up being the first ones to witness that Christ was risen. And they were entrusted with a very special message to deliver that back to the other believers.
To be the very first evangelists to share the good news was such an unlikely situation, right? Where Christ shared that first to women. Now let's back up, though, because I am just as equally blessed and mystified at the same time that at the cross, there were women there. Those women followers were present at the cross. I think we have reason to believe John was at the cross, but by and large, the other 11 were not, right? Don't you think that speaks a little bit to life-giving?
Yeah.
Right? And their in tuneness to the needs of Christ. And I mean, we see that in motherhood for sure, that moms are willing to withstand and undergo great harm, right? And put themselves at great risk for life. And we see that there.
You know, something that's coming to mind too as we're talking about this, Matt, is just these are very broad characteristics that we're seeing across many different women. And I love that because I think one of the areas where we fall today is that we start to stereotype and we start to say women should be this, men should do this. And you see how the characteristics of God can play out in both genders in so many different ways and be used across life situations, stages of life, just a lot of different areas.
I think that's so exciting to see God's wisdom in that in humankind we carry and bear his likeness. And he has distributed that among the genders and given them uniqueness. Okay? Now, that's not to say, though, that a male doesn't have some of those godlike qualities that he has entrusted to women.
Right.
And women don't have some of those godlike qualities that he's stewarded in men.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
Correct.
And I think that's an important point.
It is.
I mean, what kind of man would we be if we were all man, right? Does that make sense? And didn't have any of those helper, life-giving, relational kind of qualities. So there's some health in that.
Definitely. It's a good balance to be able to have that.
Friends, thanks for being along today. We hope that this episode was glorifying to God and helpful to you. And Amber, thanks for being a voice in this important space regarding gender. We've benefited from your experiences, and you've helped us see that God's design in gender is very, very good, and he has indeed blessed it.